If you're constantly feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling like you're drowning in your responsibilities, then this can be a sign of imposter syndrome. Of course, if there's an insecurity, if you're doubting your ability, whether it be to help patients, whether it be to hire the right person, train the right person, whether it be to step out your four walls and actually market your practice, this is a sign of imposter syndrome. If there's a background anxiety, if you're worrying that others will discover that you're not as competent, perhaps you've led them to believe, then that's a real sign of imposter syndrome. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, folks. Hey, welcome to another episode of the Marketing Your Practice podcast, the podcast where I have the pleasure of simplifying the marketing and the mindset so you, the chiropractor, can increase your income, your impact, and your enjoyment in practice too. In today's episode, we're going to be talking about a topic that's very close to the heart of many chiropractors. We're going to be talking about imposter syndrome. I've spoken about this numerous times on the podcast before, and it remains one of the number one barriers that prevents chiropractors from stepping outside their practice and marketing. Now, many of you will be aware of that nagging feeling that maybe you're not as capable as others think you are, that perhaps sooner or later someone's going to find out that you're not as competent maybe as you've led them to be. This is an incredibly familiar feeling for many of us as chiropractors. And in today's episode, I'm going to talk you through 3 key steps to help you start to overcome imposter syndrome. Okay, now the first of those is recognizing and acknowledging. Now, we'll dive deeper into these in a moment. The second step is all about reframing our thoughts. And the third one is the importance of community and seeking support in this as well. By the end of this episode, you'll have some actionable tips or tools to start shifting your mindset so you can really begin to embrace your true potential there as well. So let's jump in. Let's dismantle that imposter syndrome once and for all. Let me define imposter syndrome because this will be kind of useful for us. It's a really well-known psychological pattern. Basically, what ends up happening is it's where we doubt our accomplishments and we have a persistent fear of being exposed as a fraud or something similar. Now, there are some key points of this too. It originates from some form of perfectionism, self-doubt, or societal pressures. In many cases, it begins in our childhood, things that happen from our preachers, our teachers, our parents, little things that are often said that might have been inconsequential from the mouths of the people they came from, but we've really taken these on board. It can affect anyone, regardless of their level of success or competence. This is not just for new practitioners, because I work with chiropractors that have been in practice for decades and they still experience it. And we see many of our A-list celebrities, elite level athletes that suffer from imposter syndrome. Okay, so if you suffer from imposter syndrome, please know that you're not alone as well. Now, what does it kind of look like and how does it show up in practice? There are many different ways of this too, but if you're constantly feeling overwhelmed, if you're feeling like you're drowning in your responsibilities, then this can be a sign of imposter syndrome. Of course, if there's an insecurity, if you're doubting your ability, whether it be to help patients, whether it be to hire the right person, train the right person, whether it be to step out your 4 walls and actually market your practice, this is a sign of imposter syndrome. If there's a background anxiety, if you're worrying that others will discover that you're not as competent as perhaps you've led them to believe, then that's a real sign of imposter syndrome also. When we learn to harness imposter syndrome, because I'm not sure that and we'll talk about this as we begin, I'm not sure that we ever get over it, because as we begin to grow, and this has certainly been my experience and many people that I've spoken to, as we begin to grow as individuals, our goals get bigger and we should be stepping into unknown areas and doing things that we've never done before. And so it's healthy at these stages for a level of imposter syndrome to come in, but we want to be not paralyzed by it. This is one of those things I spent probably a decade of my life really looking at how I could, get rid of fear. I didn't want any fear in my life there, fear holding me back. And I realized when I got to spend some time with some incredibly successful men, billionaires, NFL footballers, leaders of this industry, each of these men still had fear, but the key was they weren't paralyzed by it. They weren't held back. And imposter syndrome is much the same way. It's not about completely getting rid of it. Okay, it's a healthy sign there, but it's about not being paralyzed by it. So when we learn to not be paralyzed by it, there's a real confidence. Okay, it trusts in your experience, it trusts in your training. There's a trust that you can have in your ability to be able to learn new things. You can become much more focused because you're going to be able to prioritize your actions without second guessing. And again, there's a real calmness. Okay. So we're able to approach each day with clarity and with self-assurance. And whether it be that we're doing something new, we're just not being completely overwhelmed by it. So how do we head from that state where imposter syndrome is actually holding us back and paralyzing into a state where we can actually sort of push it to the side? Well, let's talk our way through 3 steps that will really help you with this. The first is And perhaps this is the most difficult, and this is to recognize and acknowledge that it is imposter syndrome that's holding you back, okay? So it is about recognizing that perhaps the thoughts that you're having might not be based on reality. And this is the really difficult thing, because you're going to have a whole laundry list of reasons why you're right. But we have to have a level of mindfulness and self-awareness that, this could be imposter syndrome, and I may be getting in my own way. The actual fear of me being a fraud is more about internal doubts than it is about actual competence. So the first step is being open to the idea that imposter syndrome is actually a psychological pattern and it's not an objective truth. Now, I'm going to just take you through some questions in a moment there too, okay? Now, I've had several experiences with this over the last, decade, but, one that pops to mind for me is a wonderful chiropractor I was working with inside of Community Influencer, who before she was a chiropractor, she was actually a nurse and had been a nurse for a couple of decades. Amazing at what she was doing. And we were talking about her love of posture and her wanting to put more posture-related content out to her community. But she had this sense of feeling like a fraud, like, who am I to be talking about posture? Now, let's not ignore the fact that she had a nursing degree and then 20 years of experience of understanding how the human body works, then 5 years as a chiropractor, and then a couple of years in practice after that. And I remember saying to her, if you can't talk about posture, then who can? We have to understand that sometimes these barriers that are coming up are not based on reality also. So there's some reflective questions that can be really helpful to identify this. And the first one I often ask people is, what evidence do you have that supports your belief that you're not as competent as others might think? So, in this situation, what evidence do you have that you can't talk about posture? And if we really get and connect with ourselves, and often we find that this has been very much built upon, a straw house there as well. We can ask ourselves the question, look, have I received positive feedback or recognition from peers, mentors, or patients in the past, with regards to this specific thing? Have I been able to teach them about posture? Have I been able to help them correct their posture? Have I helped people with posture issues there too? Question number 3, do I hold myself to a higher standard than I do others? And this is something that across the board that most of us will do. Certainly if we're healthy, we hold ourselves to a standard that nobody else would. And again, when we look at this, if I look at people online who are talking about health, many of them do not have the hours and the experience that you have as a chiropractor. Most of them don't have a 5-year degree. Most of them don't have the understanding of anatomy and physiology and health science that you have. And yet we're not ignoring the content. Many of the people that you possibly admire as authors and books that you've read don't have the experience that you have, okay? Question number 4, how do my qualifications and experience compare to others in the field? And that's kind of pretty much what I mentioned there too. Most of the time, you're super qualified. The reason that chiropractors around the world in most places are recognized as a doctor there too is because of the level of experience and the level of training that we have, okay? Understanding that the medical practitioner, the physiotherapist, they don't know more than what you know. In fact, last week I had one of my life's highlights. I was a patient for Edison in student clinic. He's in his 4th year at the moment. And he was telling a story how one of his best buddies is a physiotherapist and he came in to have an assessment. So again, his 4th year of his final year of his physiotherapy. And he was having an assessment with Ed in the chiropractic student clinic and he was blown away because I can't believe we've done none of this stuff. Okay, so question number 5, what would I tell a colleague who expressed the same doubts? And so if you had a peer of yours who had the same doubts about themselves or showing up the same imposter syndrome, who was showing up feeling like a fraud, what would you tell them? Okay, in many cases, we'd be able to kind of correct their thoughts. We'd be able to point to evidence in the past where they've been able to do things. We would show them they do have the qualifications. The final question here that can be really useful as well is, are you comparing your current progress to somebody else's highlight reel? And this is often what we do, particularly with social media. We see the end result of, someone puts out a really amazing video where they're articulate, it's well edited, it really brings a point across. And then when we can't do that in one take, but we don't see maybe that's taken 10 or 12 takes. So for instance, this podcast episode that you're listening to at the moment, it took me 4 goes to get the introduction right. But you don't see any of that, okay? You get the highlight reel at the end there that's been edited by Jason, that bits and pieces have been cut out with it. And much of what we're showing around the world is that we're sharing our highlight reels. So be aware that when you're comparing yourself to others, certainly they didn't, if it's not their highlight reel that they're showing there too, they didn't begin there. There was a time when they were really poor also. I happened to see on social media recently, Ed Sheeran was sharing an audio clip of one of the first songs that he recorded. He was a teenager at the time there too. And his voice was horrible. Like the guitar started playing off, the guitar sounded quite good and he started singing there too, but it was painful to listen to. And I'm a huge Ed Sheeran fan. I love his voice now, but he didn't start like that. That was repetition and practice is what allowed him to get to where he was. So you need to stop comparing yourself, your current level of progress, to somebody else's highlight reel. So step number one is really all about recognizing and acknowledging that the barrier that you're putting up there may not be based on reality, okay? It may well be just something that's going on inside of your head, an imposter syndrome, okay? Now, this leads us to step number two. Once we're open to the idea of this, the next thing that we need to do is we need to begin to reframe our thoughts and we need to tell a different story. Now, this is not as simple because, for instance, if the thought that you're having in your mind is, I don't have the confidence or I don't have the skill sets for me to be able to go out and give a community talk. Perhaps somebody's asked you to go into a corporate place, or maybe it's a school place or a sporting place. And you're telling yourself, I don't have the skills to be able to do that. It's not as simple to go, okay, I realize this might be imposter syndrome, so therefore I'm just going to tell myself that I can do it. What we need to do, there's several steps that we can go through, but we need to start to challenge that internal dialogue, and we need to begin to shift that one from, potential or towards potential and towards growth as well. Now, there are three things that I like to do in this situation that's really helped me is I like to look for evidence of the contrary. So in me, if I'm have a bunch of doubts in my mind about doing something, I want to look for, have I done something like this or have I done this in the past? And often I go, you have. So if I'm putting together a talk for another conference and I'm feeling nervous about it, I'm like, Angus, you have done hundreds of these and to date, all of them has worked out great and you get more times than not really lovely feedback, okay? So just by looking for evidence of the contrary, that's something that's really helpful for me, okay? So when have I been successful in a task similar to this one in the past, okay? Now, there are going to be times, and as you start to expand forwards, when you don't have evidence. So if you don't have evidence for you being able to do this in the past, the next thing I'm doing when I'm looking for evidence, do I have evidence of somebody similar to me? Okay, is there somebody similar to me that's done this in the past? Now, this is part of my self-confidence, and I have grown this over time, that I have a belief that if somebody else can do it and I want to do it, then I'll be able to do it also. Okay, so I look for other people who've been able to navigate the path before him because I believe that if one person can and I want to do it, okay, so just because somebody's played NBA basketball doesn't mean that I can, but I don't want to play NBA basketball, okay? If we can see that somebody else has been able to do this. This was really useful for me getting through, university, starting to be a chiropractor when we get to things like neuroanatomy and, some of the cellular sciences and some of those things that, are challenging there. I would look at the group of students before me and I went, Angus, there are hundreds, thousands of students that have got through this beforehand, okay? They don't have anything that you don't. Just work hard and you can get through it, okay? Now, the second part of this that can be really useful, if we're having difficulty finding evidence, what can be useful is using a bridged statement, okay? So if I said to somebody, what is your belief around the idea? Let's go back to that example of, I'm going to do some corporate talks. And they're saying, I can't do them because I don't have the confidence. Now, if we just change that around and said, the statement they were going to be saying is, I'm confident that I can give a great corporate talk. And I said to somebody, what is your believability on that? If this was an area of imposter syndrome for you, by merely just changing that around and now saying it in the positive, your believability is probably going to be a 4 or 5 out of 10. So just by stating it that way doesn't mean that you're going to feel all of a sudden confident about it. It'll help to improve. But one of the ways that can really make a difference is by using a bridging statement. So rather than jumping straight to a positive affirmation, because there's often a level of inauthenticity there. Oh, that took a bit to get out there too. If it's outside of our reach there too. Bridging statements. Okay, so it could be, I'm open to the idea that I could be great at giving a corporate talk, or I'm learning how to become more confident in giving a corporate talk, or I'm becoming a person who's skilled at. So if I just switch that around and I say, look, what about this for a statement? I'm open to the idea that I could be great at giving a corporate talk. What's your level of believability there? And often they'll go from a 5 out of 10 to an 8 out of 10. And so these bridging statements are something that I use on a weekly, if not a daily basis. I'm open to the idea. I'm learning that. I'm becoming a person. So these 3 things that I put in front of that positive statement there, there's a greater level of authenticity there for me, because just stating that positive affirmation, sometimes there can be such a distance from where I am right now to where I want to go. By just stating in the positive, it just feels inauthentic and I can't buy it. But if I pop that bridging statement on the front there, it can make a big difference, okay? The third part of this, when we're wanting to really, tell a different story, is that we have to be prepared to embrace a level of failure, okay? And we need to take on a growth mindset. This is just part of it. Because even as working our way through all the steps that we'll talk through, it's not going to be a guarantee that you will get it right first time. Okay, maybe the corporate talk that you do isn't going to be as successful. Maybe the first video that you create won't be good. Maybe the first report of findings or, the first hire, there are going to be challenges there. So adopting a growth mindset involves us seeing challenges or failures as opportunities for learning. Okay, it may well be one of the most significant mindset upgrades that you can make. In fact, Carol Dweck in her work out of Stanford would suggest that when we adopt and continue to work at a growth mindset, that it has an impact on everything from our relationships to our longevity, to our health, to our income. Okay, it just runs across everything. And so this is something that we need to constantly remind ourselves that there are wins or there are lessons. Inside of Community Influencer, we start off our Monday morning training with a review of last week. What were our wins and what were our lessons? We're training ourselves to be looking for a growth mindset, okay? We can learn this. Reading Carol Dweck's book, Mindset, would be a really good spot to start. So this is all about really viewing failure as feedback, okay? So let's just touch on those. The second part of this is all about reframing your thoughts and telling a different story. So first is look for evidence of the contrary, okay? Have you done something like this beforehand, okay? Or something similar? And if you haven't, is there somebody that's similar to you that's done it that you can take confidence from, okay? The second is the use of those bridging statements. So rather than just going straight for the positive affirmation, which can feel inauthentic, we use those bridging statements. I'm open to the idea. I'm learning to become, I'm becoming a person who is. These can be really useful there too. And the final one there is we need to make sure that we're embracing a growth mindset and we need to change our relationship with failure. The third step, if we're wanting to overcome imposter syndrome, is to make sure that we seek some support or mentorship, okay? So in this situation or this step through here, we really want to focus on the importance of surrounding ourselves with a network of people who can offer perspective, encouragement and guidance. Now, one of the things that happens inside of Community Influencer, particularly when people are starting to make videos, is I encourage them to let me be their video conscience. So make a video and send it to me and I'll let you know whether it's postable or not. Now, of the videos I get, 9 out of 10 of them that come to me where the chiropractor says, this is terrible, I hate it, there's too many ums and ahs and I'm not doing this great or that great or there's no emotion in it too. 9 out of 10 of those I go, that is absolutely postable. It's great. We are the harshest judge on ourselves. We judge ourselves much more harshly than anybody else ever would. And so I had a chiropractor recently, an amazing Aussie chiropractor who reached out. It took her a long time to get her first 6 weeks of umming and ahhing and backwards and forwards and with this. And when she finally got her video to me, I was jaw-dropping with how good and how natural, and yet she still saw every imperfection. Now, that's part of the way that our brain works when we put the effort into it. Both Lauren and I have done a lot of renovations in around our house, and I know where every imperfection is in this place, every area that's not perfectly straight. We did some paving just, yesterday, and I'm looking at that paving early this morning and went, it's a bit crooked there and that one's up a bit high. But nobody else would notice that, okay? So the key here to realize is that imposter syndrome is often exacerbated by isolation and the internalization of our doubts. When we connect with others, and particularly when they're providing some kind of external validation, this reality check is often really, really valuable. So realize that you might not be the very best judge of your abilities, okay? Now, the community and the support can look like lots of different things. It can be just as simple as a friendship. So if you've got a peer that's on the same journey who has some expertise to be able to assess you and give some feedback. Again, if we're looking for somebody to review your videos and your mum has never watched a video and doesn't know what to look for in a video, then she might not be the best person, but you've probably got someone. Often there are different Facebook groups, there are online communities, and these can be a really great space to connect with others in similar situations there too. And of course, not necessary, but there are paid memberships or coaching. Now, there's a paid coaching program that I'm a part of. And one of the most valuable things that I get from this is that regularly the students who are ahead of me will kind of just do an open book and explain all about their businesses. They'll talk about where they've come from, the challenges along the way, how they've overcome those challenges, and they'll talk about their results now. just being a part of a community there where I can see people like me who've overcome those challenges, I find that incredibly inspiring. In fact, it's probably the most inspiring part I find about this community is just seeing other people having done it, okay? It's worth the price that I pay. It's tens of thousands of dollars a year. If I can just see that, because it helps to encourage, it helps to inspire me, it helps me know that there are other people that have paved the pathway before me as well, okay? All right, let's sum all of this up. There are 3 steps if we want to overcome imposter syndrome. The first is to recognize and acknowledge that what's holding you back is imposter syndrome. It's a psychological phenomenon rather than something that's based in reality. Now, once we're open to the idea that this might be the case, the second thing we need to do is reframe our thoughts and tell a different story, okay? We want to look for evidence that we've done this in the past or someone similar to us has done this. We can then start to use bridging statements, and we need to reframe our relationship with failure. The final part that can be really useful for this is to make sure that you seek support, a friend, an online group, a mentorship, or part of paid coaching. These 3 things all together wrapped in time and patience, because depending on the level of the paralysis that you have, this might be something that's really quick to overcome. And maybe just listening to this episode that you'll be up for shooting your first video this afternoon, or doing your report of findings in a different way, or employing that new person, or leaving your job, starting a new one. Those sorts of things can come. And so for many of you, it can be really quick. But for some of us, and depending on the size of it, this can be something that takes a bit of time. So be patient with yourself. And remember, like I said beforehand, my experience, and with many people that I've coached, is that imposter syndrome is not one of those things that you just put to bed forever. We learn to have it not paralyze us rather than us getting rid of it. So folks, 3 steps there to help you overcome imposter syndrome. As always, thanks for all that you do. Keep saving lives. Your community desperately needs you overcoming imposter syndrome, so you can show up as the very best version of you, because that's what helps to save lives. All right, folks, see you back here next week. Bye. If you've enjoyed listening to this podcast, you have to come and check out my Community Influencer Program. It's my monthly coaching program where we take all this material and I'll work with you to help you apply it, implement it, and systemize it. The Community Influencer Group Coaching Program is designed to help you increase your practice income, impact, and enjoyment. Join me over at anguspyke.com/join. That's anguspyke.com/join. I'd love to see you there.